everyone, and welcome to the latest message in our series, The King and His Kingdom, based upon the Gospel of Matthew. My name's John, and I work with the leadership team here at Coventry Vineyard. And today we're going to look at a very well-known story, and I've entitled this talk, Miraculous Multiplication. Now, the context for us as a church is that as we head out of lockdown and we head into the autumn, we continue to be spurred on by the Spirit of God calling us to grow. The clear vision that God's given to us as a church is to become one church of disciple-making disciples in multiple locations across Coventry. Now, this is a call to the whole of Coventry Vineyard, to each one of us. And I want to start this morning by asking you how you feel about that. Do you feel excited? Do you feel fearful? Do you feel hopeful? Perhaps you even feel tired. And perhaps you feel all of those at different times as we have walked through this journey over the last 18 months. But I really want to encourage you to see what we can learn from Matthew's Gospel this morning and how we can apply this teaching to our lives, to our situations, and all that God is calling us into. And I suppose the key question that we should be asking is, how should we respond when we are asked by Jesus to do what seems utterly impossible to us? Now, I want to start this morning with a word of wisdom from Richard Branson. He writes this, or he said this: if someone offers you an amazing opportunity and you're not sure you can do it, say yes, and then learn how to do it later. Now, despite his appearance, Richard Branson isn't Jesus, and he's not the Messiah. But in his encouragement, he does share an insight into the potential flaw of humanity. That is, that if we don't think we can do something, it's a real hindrance to us trying in the first place. But if we don't try, then we will never know what might have been. And the truth is, on a human level, we will never know what we are capable of unless we try. But in trying, there is always the risk of opening ourselves up to the possibility of failure. And on the faith level, the same principles can apply. You know, God is offering us in Coventry Vineyard and around the world, he offers all his people an amazing opportunity to participate with him in the growth of the kingdom. And how much more amazing is that than anything that the world has to offer? And that's the offer, if you like, that God has given to us as a church. What he wants to do things in Coventry, and he's inviting us to participate with him in that. But how we respond will determine our experience. So if we can respond in faith, then we can experience much more of God, what God does in us and through us, and how he transforms the communities in which we live and serve. But if we respond in fear, then that has the effect of crippling our faith. And actually it prevents us from wholeheartedly pursuing the purposes of God. And in so doing, we rob ourselves of experiencing God in a deeper and a fuller measure. Today we are going to look at the account of the feeding of the 5,000 and see what that can teach us and how that can encourage us to respond in faith to the challenge God is presenting us. Now, it is a unique text, the feeding of the 5,000, because although it may be familiar to all of us, did you know that it's the only miracle that appears in all four Gospels? And what that means is that we get four perspectives of the same story. And if we can look at each of those, then we can gain a more holistic picture of what was going on. And so what I've done is I've interlinked those four stories together. So we see it in Matthew chapter 14, we can see it in Mark chapter 6, we can see it in Luke chapter 9, and also in John chapter 6. So by putting all of those together and adding a little bit of context for clarification, I'm going to take you through that text. I do encourage you, actually, that's a good exercise to go through. You can see how different disciples or different writers have brought a different element and a different emphasis to that same story. So let's read it together. Sometime after hearing of the death of John the Baptist, the apostles returned from their first ministry trip. They reported to Jesus what they had done. And when Jesus heard what had happened, and because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, He said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." They withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place, to a town called Bethsaida, on the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns because they saw the signs Jesus had performed by healing the sick. They ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. He welcomed them and spoke to them, teaching them many things about the kingdom of God, and he healed their sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late." When Jesus looked up and saw the great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. The disciples said, "Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough food for each one to have a bite. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people, as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So the first question that I want to ask you today is, do you believe this story? Is this story true? Is God really able to multiply what we give to him? Did he multiply what the disciples gave to him? And there's one thing to believe that God can do something. We might believe that God is able to do anything. But when that faith challenge is then personalised and God says to us, well, you do something, the question changes from can God do something to will God do something? And that's a much greater challenge. And so I guess the challenge to us today is, can God multiply what we give to him today? Is this experience of multiplication possible for us in our context? Now we can look at the Bible, we can look at history, church history, and we can look at contemporary testimonies around the world, the amazing things that God is doing today. And all of those can encourage our faith. And so one key part of this passage is really to be a community of people who encourage one another in our faith and in our confidence in God. Because having faith releases participation and engenders an attitude of generosity. If we really believe that God can multiply what we give him, then it becomes, rather than one of, I don't want to give him what I've got. Actually, we will run to God and say, here, have this. This is all I've got, but take it and multiply it for the blessings of others and for the growth of the kingdom. And so we can encourage one another to, as William Carey would say, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. Because, I think what William Carey understood is that an active faith must express itself in action. And as we act and see God do things, that increases our faith. It's a bit like a cycle. We have faith, we act, we see God do things, it encourages our faith, and we act all the more. And so we can build one another up. And one of the key ways we do that is by sharing stories. And we're trying to do that ongoingly as we grow together as a church. But what I want to do now is let's look at that same passage again. And this time, in each of those sections, I want to look at some of the teaching points that I think these passages highlight. So as I look at this section of the passage we're looking at this morning, I take away 3 points from this. And the first is that life goes on in the midst of tragedy and celebration. We see this group of people, Jesus and his disciples. Jesus had just heard that his cousin, John the Baptist, had been beheaded. So he's filled with grief and sadness at that tragedy. At the same time, the disciples are coming, sharing stories, celebrating what they had seen God do, amazed at the work of God in and through them. And often in life, we have to manage that balance. And as we come out of lockdown and into a new season of ministry, there will be lots of people with lots of stories, things to celebrate and things to grieve with people about. But that's all part and parcel of life. The second thing is that Jesus wants to hear our stories. He's making that effort to take the disciples away to hear. And I think, when we share stories, they're not just to be shared amongst ourselves. We can encourage our faith by talking to Jesus, by telling him also how amazed we are at what he's doing, but also how thankful we are that he is sustaining us through the challenges, the trials, and the celebrations of life, and particularly when they all come together. The third thing to notice is that Jesus cares for the disciples, not just their souls and their spirits, but their bodies also. He's aware that they've been through a particularly difficult time of ministry. So he is taking them away to restore them, to refresh them, and even to give them something to eat. They've been so busy that they haven't eaten. And so from this, I take 3 points. The first is that Jesus is drawing people to himself. There is a hunger for God that the Spirit works in the people around us. And it's that hunger that drives them to seek him out. And so again, it's just an encouragement to our faith to see that actually there are people in this city who are hungry for Jesus. That is the work of the Spirit. Jesus is and continues to draw people to himself. The second point is that Jesus is compelled by love and compassion. And in one sense, we saw, didn't we, that the disciples were at that point where they were tired, they were hungry. And yet still, when Jesus is confronted with crowds who are just like sheep without a shepherd, he prioritizes those in need over those who have. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn. I will pick up later that doesn't mean that God is neglecting his disciples. But what it does mean is that we as God's people need to prioritize the needs of those who don't know Jesus over our own needs. And that's a really important heart attitude as we humble ourselves before God. We put Jesus first, we put others first, and we let God care for us. And again, Jesus ministers and cares about the whole person. So he doesn't just heal their sick, he also proclaims the gospel. And so there is that wonderful balance of faith and works, of word and works. We need to be sharing the gospel with people, and we need to be demonstrating the reality of the gospel through how we relate to one another and to the communities around us. Sometimes Jesus begins to build our faith by presenting us with a challenge. In this case, where are we going to get bread for all these people? Now, he doesn't present those challenges because he doesn't know what he's going to do. The text is very clear. He already knows what he's going to do and what lessons he's wanting to teach. But he asks these questions, I think, to begin to stir us up to see how we are going to respond. And one of the ways in which we can respond is either through fear. We don't want to have anything to do with it. Or we can respond in our own strength and think, well, here's a good solution. We could do this. But Jesus is always trying to expand our faith. And so sometimes when we respond in our own strength, he goes that little bit further and he stretches us and says, well, yeah, you could do that. But actually, in this case, there's something bigger, there's something greater. So don't go off and try and find enough bread for them. You do something about it. You give them something to eat. And what an incredible challenge that is in the face of 5,000 men, plus women, plus children. You give them something to eat. I don't know about you, but probably if I was in that situation, I'd begin to panic and think, what on earth is going to happen here? I think one of the things we can take from this passage, it's no bad thing to express incredulity to God. He's well able to deal with our questions. He's well able to deal with our wondering, how on earth is this going to work? And so being in faith doesn't mean that we don't have questions. Being in faith means we trust despite the questions that we may have. Even if we cannot understand, we trust that God is able. Sometimes we can respond to the impossible by actually thinking it's possible. And so we can reorient our resources, but actually it's still self-sufficiency. We're still thinking we have enough to do what God is calling us to do, even though deep down we know that we don't. None of us has enough to do what God is wanting to do in and amongst us. And yet sometimes it's easier to trust the things we have than to trust God for the things that we don't have. And another response we can give to the being presented with the impossible is just simply giving to God what we have. Now we can do that individually, our time, our talents, our resources, or we can do it collectively. So God is not asking us to bring to him what we don't have. Jesus wasn't asking them to miraculously produce bread or fish for the crowds. What he's asking is, bring to me what you have. And actually that offering is an act of faith. Don't forget, these disciples are hungry and they've come away expecting Jesus to give them something to eat. So by giving away what little they have, actually is giving away what they were expecting. But it's an act of faith. And so the word of faith is, Jesus asks for the impossible. Our response is, okay, I'll do it. And here's what I've got. It's a simple, humble offering. I know this is ridiculous. I know that what I'm giving to you is in no way capable of fulfilling what you're asking me to do. But that's all I've got to give you. And so I'm giving it to you willingly. Jesus asks that of us as he's challenging us to go into the different communities of Coventry and to build a growing fellowship of disciple-making disciples in multiple locations. Who amongst us has the capacity to do that? None of us. But all Jesus is asking us is individually and together. Let's bring to him what we've got. Let's offer it to him and say, yes, we'll trust you to do the impossible. And we'll trust you to multiply what we bring. But it is a faith offering, and we have to be willing to give to God all that we have. From this section of the passage, I think there are a couple of things that we can reflect on. The first is that the multiplication, the miracle, the miraculous multiplication came after the act of obedience and not before. When Jesus asks us to do the impossible, we might think it would be better for us if he were to give us everything we needed before we started. But I don't think Jesus works like that. Because it isn't just the accomplishing of what he's wanting to do that's important. It is our growth and our understanding of the largeness and the awesomeness of God. And that comes through faith and through obedient steps of faith. And as an outcome of that, all of the glory goes to God and not to man. If God gave us everything we need, then we would apportion it and we would apply it to different situations, and God would accomplish his purposes. And there might be a temptation in that for us to step back and say, oh, didn't we steward that well? But actually, we want to see the wonder of God. We want to see the awe of God. We want to be amazed at God's ability and capacity to do the miraculous. And that's why this is a faith-stretching exercise. This vision to go into Coventry's communities and to see multiplying disciples in multiple locations. It is going to stretch us. But I'm believing that as we go through this process, we will have a greater vision of the awe and the wonder of God. And we will each be in a greater place to worship him for who he is. But I want you to draw your attention to right back to the beginning of the passage. Remember, Jesus was taking away the disciples after a busy season of ministry where they'd been so busy and they hadn't had time to eat. He was taking them away to restore them and to refresh them. Then he took them on this kind of like sideways journey and said, yeah, I wanted to do that, but let's care for the people that have just come to us. But at the end of it, the disciples were very well fed. But they had much more than a meal. They had a meal and they had a testimony of the glory and awesomeness of God and his capacity to work. So he had allowed their faith to be stretched, and they had allowed themselves to be stretched by God, and they were rewarded as a result. And again, I just think ahead maybe in 12 months' time, 18 months' time, when we can celebrate together just what God has done amongst us. And maybe God will show us things that are far, far beyond our comprehension at the moment. And we need to really encourage our faith and our confidence in God. So what can we take away from this passage? Well, firstly, let's be motivated by compassion. Nurture our love for God, our love for those who don't know Christ, and our love for one another. And let that be what motivates our ministry and helps us make decisions. In all our activities, let's endeavour to serve the whole person so that we can nourish the body, the soul and the spirit of each one, fulfilling our whole responsibility and not neglecting any of those aspects. Let's embrace the challenges that God puts before us with faith. Let's not try and avoid or escape them in the hope of an easy life. That's not what we're called to. It's our opportunity to experience the miraculous at work amongst us. Let's accept our limitations. Let's not try and resolve things in our own strength. We in the West, we are incredibly rich in so many different ways. And yet sometimes it's hard for those that have to trust. Sometimes it's easier to trust God when you have nothing. But let's not be people who trust what we have. Let's be people that accept that even what we have is not enough to accomplish what God is wanting to do in and through us. But let's be people of faith and bring to God what we do have, trusting that by faith it is enough if it is given to Jesus for him to multiply. Let's expect the unexpected amongst us. Let's expect God to do the miraculous. Again, this is new territory that we're moving into in this new season. We haven't been this way before. But let's be people that sow generously with expectant hearts, trusting that his multiplication is enough, not both for the challenge that we're faced with, but also for ourselves. So I hope this word this morning has been an encouragement to you as we look ahead. When more impossible things come to us, let's not move away and think, oh, this is too difficult. Let's say to God, this is what we've got, Lord. We're trusting you and we're going to move forward in your purposes. And let's really believe that God is going to act in our lives, in our ministries, really bring that multiplication that will bring him glory, extend his kingdom, and bring people into a living relationship with him. That each one of us will be built up in our faith together. So have a great summer, and I'm really looking forward to meeting face to face with you all again in the autumn, trusting that that's going to be possible. Take care. God bless.